Hi, it's Jan Howell. I am so excited to share with you a new baby pattern design, and I'm going to show you today how to make these comfy little baby slippers. It's a simple sewing tutorial that I think you're really going to like. These slippers have a really cozy ankle cuff. They're easy to slip on, and the pattern comes in 6 different sizes, all the way from newborn up to a child size. I'll be going over all the different types of fabrics that I recommend. You can make these with fleece, upcycled sweaters, and the color combinations are endless. As with all my sewing tutorials, you'll want to make sure you watch the whole thing because I give so many tips on how to cut things out, little tips on sewing that you won't want to miss. And at the end of the video, I'm going to give you a bonus tutorial on how to make these slippers non-slip for those little toddlers that are running around on tile or wood floors. So make sure you check that out at the end of the video. So without any further ado, let's get started. I have had this slipper pinned to my bulletin board for a very long time with the intention of taking it and designing a pattern. This is my son's slipper when he was a toddler, and he's now 26 years old, so that shows you how long I've had this slipper and wanted to make a pattern for it. I have some other slipper patterns that you'll want to check out, different fun designs. The thing I like about this particular slipper is the cuff. I've tweaked the pattern several times just to get the right fit, and I have come up with this particular pattern with the cuff. You can, as you can see, make them little teeny newborn size all the way up to a large, even larger than this, child size. So let's go over the materials and items and things that you'll need. You'll need the pattern printed and downloaded, and I'll put the link in the description below. Like I said, it has 6 different sizes, so choose which size you want and cut out the indicated pattern size. You'll need a pair of fabric scissors, a pair of paper scissors for the pattern, straight pins, or I really like to use these fabric clips if you have those on hand, and you'll need just a basic sewing machine. If you are going to use knit fabric, you'll want to use a jersey knit needle or a stretch needle, and you can just use a universal needle for all the other types of fabrics. A little heads up, if you ever want to know what type of needle to use for what fabric, I have this downloadable PDF chart that tells you all the details about that, and I'll put the link in the description below because the type of needle you use on different sewing projects is important. If you want to apply a cute little tag in the slipper somewhere, have that handy. And I do have a tutorial on how to make these fun little tags if you want to learn how to do that. Let's go over the fabric options that you have. As I mentioned, you can use fleece for the whole thing, the top and the bottom, and even as a lining. You have an option to line them or not to line the slipper. If it's a thin fabric, as with this knit fabric on the outside, you'll want to use 2 layers of the knit. If it's a thicker sweater and it's bulky, you might not want to line the bottom. Like I haven't lined the bottom in this particular slipper because it's a thick wool piece, a thick wool sweater on the bottom, but I have lined the upper part with a piece of fleece. So I encourage you, when you're deciding what kind of fabric to use, all types of felted sweaters. And I have a tutorial on how to do that because felted sweaters is a fun material to use, and it gives your project so much character. There is a process of getting the wool sweater prepared for your projects, and I have a tutorial on how to do that. So you'll need your fabric for the top piece and the bottom piece, and there's all different kinds of options there. This is a very soft, pliable leather that you could even put on the bottom of the slipper if you wanted to. You wouldn't want to use a very thick piece because that will be hard to sew and bulky for little feet. You'll need a piece of ribbing for the cuff. Ribbing is a really stretchy piece of knit fabric. As you can see here, it's kind of ribbed and very stretchy. You can buy this by the yard. It comes on a small bolt, or there are some other fun options that you can use for the cuff. Now for this particular slipper, I have used an upcycled pair of tights. It's a cotton knit tight that's really stretchy, and it ended up working out really well. It's cozy, it's comfortable, and I was able to use that. And for this slipper, I used an upcycled t-shirt. This is, now every t-shirt's not going to work because some t-shirts just don't have the stretch that you need, but this particular, see how stretchy that is? Just take your fabric and imagine and fold it over and see how it stretches and if that would work for a cuff. And you can also use the cuff of an upcycled sweater. So this is a really soft cashmere and it cuff to a sweater. If it's long enough and has that stretch, you'll need a piece of ribbing double this size, so about that size. And if your cuff isn't long enough, it won't work, but this particular cuff would make a really cute cuff on a slipper, and it's super soft. So there's some options for the cuff fabric. For the tutorial today, let me show you what fabric pieces I have chosen. So we're going to use this felted brown sweater. It's tightly woven. It's fairly thick, but I am going to put a piece of lining on the inside just to give it some more bulk and to make it a little bit more cozy on the foot. When you're using upcycled sweaters, I wanted to point out that you want to make sure, hold it up to the light when you cut it, when you're getting ready to cut out, and make sure there's not any holes. See that hole? It's not real fun when you cut a piece out and there's a hole in your sweater. So make sure that the fabric that you're using does not have any holes. So we'll use that piece for the sole piece. I'm going to use this upcycled sweater, gray sweater, for the top, and this really cozy, soft cashmere sweater for the lining. I wish you could feel that. That's so soft. That will make the inside of the slipper feel really good. Don't you just love the olive colors and the variegation of the green in this stretchy piece of fabric? It's a sleeve to a sweater that I've saved. So I think this will be fun for the cuff. So I have cut out 2 of the lining upper pieces, 2 of the outer upper slipper pieces, 2 of the outer sole piece, and I have decided to use a piece of fleece instead of that cashmere sweater on the lining of the sole. So I have 4 pieces for the sole and 4 pieces for the side. Now we're going to cut out the ribbing and the cuff. As you can see on the pattern, we're placing it on the fold, and you want to make sure that it's on the stretch of the fabric. You'll need 2 of these. So one of the methods of making the slippers non-slip is to sew these little rubber patches on the bottom. You could make these little patches out of leather, or I have used this rubber shelf liner, and it works really well. We'll cut 4 of these out, 2 for the upper and 2 for the heel. So if you are applying those patches to the soles of the slipper, let's do that first. Take the outer piece and place the right side facing down and the fleece side that you want exposed facing up. And we're just going to decide where to put that upper patch on the sole of the foot. You want it to be about 1 inch away from the edge, so about there, and pin them in place. I'm going to take these to the sewing machine using a zigzag stitch, sewing all the way around the border of those patches. Let's get the heel seams ready so that we can just take everything to the sewing machine and sew them while we're over there. The next step is to sew the heel seam. Decide which side of the fabric you want to be the outside and bring the right sides together. If you want to add that heel tag, this is the time to do it. So let me just show you how you apply that. Get your tag ready, and if it is a letter or something like this, you want it to be facing upright. Find the center and make sure you're accounting for the seam allowance, which is 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to scoot it over about that far, and then I'm just going to baste that in place. You could just pin it, but I like to baste it, then it's secure and I know it's not going to move around and get all funky when I sew it. So I'm going to leave that open, clip it in place. If you're not applying the tag, just bring the right sides together and sew your seam. And you'll do the same thing for the lining, except you don't have to worry about the tag. Those are ready to sew, and let's get the cuff ready to sew. You can decide which side of the fabric you want exposed, and I really like that ribbed look, so that's going to be my right side. I'm going to bring the long edges right sides facing and just sew straight down that side seam. Sew around these patches. I've set my sewing machine to a zigzag stitch, the width at 5 and the length 1.5. Also, so the zigzag is on the edge of the patch. I'll backstitch at the beginning and the end. Clip your threads. We'll set those aside and work on the other pieces. Let's baste the tag in place. And I'm not going to use the full seam allowance. I will just sew right close to the edge there to keep it in place using a straight stitch. Then I'll bring the right sides together and sew that seam. I'm using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, which is usually just the edge of your presser foot. I always like to open it up and make sure the tag is straight and how I want it, because there's sometimes when I'll sew the whole project, my tag is crooked and there's really no way to fix it at that point. So it's better to check it now, and that looks good. Now let's sew the heel seam of the lining. And now sew the ribbing for the cuff. Right sides together. You could use a serger if you really wanted to, except that I find when the slippers are a little like the newborn size and everything, it's just a little bit too small and the serger is a little bit more difficult to use. But you could use it for the ribbing and the other pieces really if you wanted to. Now there are two different ways to apply the cuff. I'm going to show you both methods and you can decide which one you want to use. Now the difference is, the first method I'm going to show you is you can just sew the cuff on to the slipper and have the seam exposed. This is the fleece slipper that I've made, and either way is fine, except that I find that there's another method that you can use if you don't want that seam exposed, and it's a little bit more comfy to have that seam inside the lining. This particular slipper doesn't even have a lining, which is fine, and a lot of people sew them up this way. This second method, you sew it so the seam allowance is not exposed. It's sandwiched between the outside and the inner lining. So as you can see here, there is no seam exposed on the inside or on the outside, which does make it a little bit more cozy. It's just a little bit different pinning it together. Either is fine. On this method, you'll want to finish the seam off with a zigzag stitch like I have here. Let's go over this first method. Take the top piece and place it wrong side facing out, and then take the top piece and then take the lining piece and place it on top with the wrong side facing down. So the wrong sides are facing each other. Open up the seam allowance and just line those up like that. Grab your cuff, fold it the top over so it's doubled up, and the folded edge is along the top. Line up your side seam there, open up the seam allowance, and place those together. You're going to find the halfway point and mark it with a pin. Do that for both cuffs. Take one of the cuffs, find the seam. We're going to stick it inside the hole there, line up the heel seams with all 4 layers and clip it in place or pin it. Take the halfway point, line up your notches on the top pieces, and then bring that halfway point of the cuff in a line with the notches and clip it in place. Now, as you can see, the cuff is smaller than, a little bit smaller than the top piece, and that's how we want it, because when we sew it, we're just going to stretch that and ease it as we go, and that will give the nice fit. Make sure your edges are together, because otherwise you may not catch one of those pieces and you'll have an opening in the seam. So I would take it to the sewing machine and sew all the way around using your 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then when you open it up, it will look like that. And you'll have that seam allowance exposed, which is fine, but you'll want to zigzag the edges like I have here, especially if you have a piece of fabric like this. Knit has a little bit of cotton in it, so it is going to fray when I wash it. We don't want that seam to come undone. So see how I've just done a basic zigzag stitch around the edge there after I have sewn that straight stitch, and that'll keep it in place. And that is your first option and method. Now let's go over the second method. Take the top piece with the outside facing up, take the cuff, let's find that halfway point again, stick it up inside the hole with the back side, with the heel seam lined up, and pin it in place. Find that halfway point, align it with the notch, and clip it in place. Now we're going to take the lining piece with the right side facing up, stick it up inside the cuff, find the heel, the top of the heel seam, open up the seam allowance and align it with the other heel seams and clip it in place. Pull up the lining piece with your other notch. So you can find that notch. We have right sides together and clip it in place. So as you can see, we have the lining piece, the cuff, and then the outside piece. Line up all 4 layer edges and clip it in place. Just stuff that down in there so it's out of the way. And you can adjust this as you're sewing, but you want to make sure that all those edges are lined up, or you may miss one of those pieces of fabric and then you'll have a hole in the seam. So it will look like this when you take it to the sewing machine, and when you open it up, I'll show you in just a minute how that magic happens. Let's do the other side real quick. I have both of these pinned and ready to sew. We're going to sew just around, all the way around, and then zigzag and finish that seam. I'm still using a straight stitch, and I'm going to use 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure your edges are lined up. Now you're working in a kind of an enclosed space, so just take your time and adjust the edges as you sew and remove your clips. Of course, you want to back stitch at the beginning and at the end of your seam. Flatten out those seam allowances as much as possible. When you get around to where you started, backstitch again. And before I do the zigzag, before I finish the seam, I like to just look through it and make sure that I have caught all layers, because if you just sew the zigzag stitch and you find out later that you didn't catch all the seams or all the layers, you have to unpick the zigzag and the straight seam. So it looks like we're good, and now I'm going to change my seam stitch back to a zigzag stitch, and I'm going to just sew zigzag on the outside of that seam, making sure not to go past the seam. Now, if you're using fleece fabric, you're not going to have to do this zigzag step, because fleece will not fray and you won't have to do that. Let's open it up. So before we open it up, you'll want to trim those notches off and any excess fabric that you have. Make sure that you're not cutting into the seam. Now let's see what happens when we open that up, and I pull the lining down. Voila, hidden seam. Now we're ready to apply the sole to the slipper. Looking pretty good. So to apply the sole piece to the top slipper, take the sole piece with the right side facing down on top of the top piece, right side facing up. You'll have your cuff sticking up here. We're just going to flatten that off as much as possible and line up our notches on all 4 layers and clip it in place. So I like to go front or top and bottom first and then do the sides. Open up that seam allowance as much as possible. Tucking everything in, going to those side notches. Now there's going to be a lot of easing and adjusting at this point because we're working with a lot of layers and knit fabric. So on that heel piece, I like to give it a little bit more. So instead of pulling that tight around the corner, give it some room and some fabric there, so it goes around that curve nicely. Might need to just adjust those side notches just a bit so that it's evenly laying flat, because some fabrics are going to stretch a little bit more than the others, and you just ease it all in and it works out fine. You can adjust this as you sew as well. Sometimes I find these corners it is easier to use a pin. Now we're ready to take it to the sewing machine and sew all the way around. I've set my sewing machine still on a straight stitch with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I like to start on one of the sides and just start sewing, back stitching of course at the beginning, and removing your pins and your clips and lining up your edges as you sew. Just take your time to go around the corners. You are sewing several layers together and several different stretches of fabric, so just ease things in as you sew. When you get back to where you started, back stitch, and then we're going to set our sewing machine to a zigzag stitch. But before we do that, you want to make sure, look at the front, look all the way around and on the other side to make sure that you've caught all the fabric. Now as you can see, there's a little place where I didn't catch that one edge of the fleece. Now fleece doesn't stretch as easy as the sweater fabric, so it's okay it was just off just a little bit, so I'm just going to increase my seam allowance right in that area, and then there's no worry about it fraying either. So then I'm going to set my machine to a zigzag stitch and sew all the way around using a width of 5 and a length of 2. And then when you've sewn all the way around, you can go ahead and trim off all the excess fabric. Now you're ready to turn it inside out. And this is the fun part. Just stick your hand in there and spread your fingers wide so that you can poke out the corners. So they all turn out a little bit different and they're just so cute. That cuff, you can fold it down, or you can just leave it if you want it higher up on the ankle. Just make it a little slouchy ankle cuff. So there's so many fun options and so many different color combinations and fabrics that you can use. If you have hardwood floors or tiles and you don't want your little ones, or if you don't want to be slipping around in your slippers, let's go over some different ways that you can make these non-slip. So the first thing that you can do is purchase what they call Jiffy Grip fabric. It comes by the yard. You can get it at most fabric stores and even online. And I'll put the description and some links in the description below. But what it is just a piece of fabric that has all these little rubber dots on them. Like if you were to purchase a pair of slippers, you know, a lot of these will have this on it. So you can cut out just your sole piece and simply use that. So that's one easy way, like I have with this little slipper here. The next method is to use, I know this is crazy, but this is shelf liner. As you can see, it's kind of gritted and it's rubbery and it keeps things from slipping around, and you can line your drawers or your shelves in your kitchen with it. It's pliable. You can cut out a second sole piece with this and just sew it in as part of the sole, or you can, like I have in these pairs of slippers, put just some pads on the front and the heel of the slipper, and you'll just simply zigzag around those before you sew the rest of it together. So the next option is to just simply use your hot glue gun to add some rubber little knobs. I'll show you on this slipper how you can make little lines on the pad of the foot or on the heel, some circles, or even just some little dots. I'm going to just make some lines, squiggly lines, going back and forth. And it really is quite amazing how effective this works. So you don't want your lines to be really, really thin, but see, so how I'm just kind of going back and forth over that area. You could do the whole slipper if you wanted to, but mostly the pad and the heel are the areas that you want to concentrate on. And you could just do a circular pattern like so. Maybe add some dots. No really right or wrong way to do this. But like I say, you want to make those lines not too thin. And just let that dry. And the other method is to use puff paint. You can get these at craft stores. You can get them in a variety of colors. What they are is acrylic paint that is quite thick and puffy actually. So you can take just any of these colors. Let's just use this brown. And I'll just show you on this slipper how you can just add little dots. Or you could do lines, of course, if you wanted to, but it's going to take some time to dry. Pretty simple, but very effective. So we'll let those dry. And one more option is to use just a piece of very pliable, soft suede. Now you don't want to use it, you want to use the side that would be non-slip. So just like I have with this pair of crossover slippers, I have used, so I have lined it and then I have cut out a piece of suede for the sole. That will also keep your slippers from slipping. So pretty simple, straightforward. Easy to do. For those of you who follow me know I love making things from upcycled sweaters, and a cozy pair of slippers are one of them. So I have several different patterns and designs of slippers that you can make for little toddlers and babies up to adults. If you haven't checked out my other videos, you might want to check those out, and my pattern designs, and I'll put the link in the description below to where you can find those patterns and tutorials. Stay tuned, because shortly I'm going to be showing you how to make these really fun slipper socks out of upcycled sweaters. If you found this information helpful and useful, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up. Make sure your notifications are turned on so when I put something new up, you get notified. Have a wonderful day, have fun making slippers, and we'll see you next time.